Thank you all for still bearing with us. It's been a long day, and we reached the last panel for today. We have only two presenters, and the panel is about Imperial legacy and unrepentant past. Our guests are Dubravka Stojanović, who is a historian, Serbian historian, and a professor at the Faculty of Philosophy of the University of Belgrade, and Sergey Lebedev, writer and journalist from Russia and now living in Germany. Two of Sergey's books have been translated, and they are offered here, published by Fraktura in Zagreb, and we have a few copies. So please, you're welcome to skip through them and buy them if you like. There is a price attached there. They can be read as spy novels, political thrillers, analysis of contemporary Russian situation, and so on. I will not, impose the role of a publisher. Okay, I will make just a very, very brief introduction. This panel should last, I hope, 90 minutes. Okay, and hopefully 1/3 of that time should be dedicated to discussion. We will have two main blocks. The first one is on basically Russia and Serbia parallels, a little bit about historical context and analysis of contemporary situation. And the second part should be dedicated to the peace part of the talk, and that is how to imagine peace, what is required, and how it would look like. I suppose our colleagues will talk about the parallels. I can only say from my part, this whole talk is called Balkan Talks on War and Peace. And this reminds me of Tolstoy's War and Peace, not so much read today, but it seems to me that there is one strong parallel that we could maybe derive from that. Tolstoy's idea, he was immediately after the publishing the book, he was recognized as a historian and admitted into historical, departments and everything, because there was something about his vision of history that was very appealing to the Russian ears. And that is, Russia is dormant, in a way passive, attacked from the West, and then being silent, awakening very, very slowly. But once it awakens, hence the idea of the Russian bear, once it awakens, then it achieves victory, absolutely. And you can see that the narrative of the Napoleonic Wars developed by Tolstoy can pretty much resemble the narrative of the Second World War. And I assume the way that this war in Ukraine is perceived from the Russian conservative mainstream perspective would be quite similar. We were passive, dormant, the West pushed until we were really forced to act. And if you know a little bit about Serbian history, it is not unheard of that Serbian perception of history can have some resemblances with that. We always win the war and we lose in peace, as Dobrica Ćosić would say. We are also, being a bit slow, not always focusing on the immediate political context, then being screwed by the West, and then eventually need to force. And every violence that was persecuted here, performed, was retaliatory or enforced upon us. Okay, enough on my part. I call Dubravka. I hope you will be dynamic and keep way of time. I will basically function as a stopwatch and maybe mildly warn you if I think there is a time to switch. Mildly.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me for this occasion, and it's wonderful to talk with Sergey. We also already had some opportunities to exchange our ideas, and it's always amazing to talk to you. Of course, I will talk much more about history. Maybe you'll talk much more about the present. But let's say for the beginning that on the first side, it will seem that Serbia and Russia are totally incomparable because, of course, Russia is a great power. Its territory, it's 200 times bigger than Serbia, and its population is 22 times bigger than Serbia. So in that from that perspective, it would look like incomparable. But on the other hand, politically, talking about foreign policy and talking about ideology, self-representation, self-understanding, there we can find many similarities. And I will try to be concrete and to talk shortly about 2 points. So the first point is foreign policy. The main similarities between the both is that they understand itself as empires, although they are incomparable, of course, as I said. But Serbia does have that self-understanding of the empire in the Balkans, and we can talk later why and where does that come from. And of course, Russia is an empire, or at least was an empire. But they are in that self-understanding, they're very comparable. They're also very comparable because they have mutual enemies, and that's historical. And that's very important because for Europe, the Balkans are the backyard. But for Russia, that's the front yard. And this is, I think, very important to understand, both for European Union today and for Serbia. And Serbia and Russia are misusing each other in practically every crisis from the 19th century until today. So they are misusing each other against different enemies. It started with the Ottoman Empire, and they have the mutual goal against the Ottoman Empire. And it's important to understand that the Balkans is the Russian front yard because that's the territory where Russia proves itself as a great power. So whether Russia is helping Balkan peoples against different enemies, or whether Russia is making different kinds of instabilities, which is, for example, the case today. So first we had Ottomans, then we had Austria, then we had Austria and Germany together. Then during the Cold War, it was, of course, the West, and it's the West today. So this is very important that they have the same enemy, let's say, and this is what brings them together. But on the other hand, if we look for different crises since the 19th century, then it's clear then that the Russia as a big brother is a myth. So if we take all the crises from the first Serbian uprising to the First World War, Russia ended with other great powers, usually against Serbian interests. So this is extremely important to understand. And this is something which is completely presented in a false way in Serbian public. So in the first Serbian uprising, okay, it ended with Napoleonic wars, and Russia, of course, had to concentrate on Napoleon. But during the Great Eastern Crisis, 1876, 1878, Russia was a Bulgarian ally, not a Serbian, and it created a greater Bulgaria, the San Stefano Bulgaria. And it was thanks to Germany and Austria that Serbia got its independence on the Berlin Congress against Russia. So that was a very important crisis. Then it was the annexation crisis of Bosnia-Herzegovina when Austro-Hungary annexed Bosnia, 1908, 1909. Again, Russia was with great powers and against what Serbia thought it was their interest. And the third crisis, though, and fourth, those were two Balkan wars where Serbia had its imperial ambitions towards the Adriatic and Aegean Sea. Again, Russia was against that. So every single crisis, of course, Russia looked after its own interests, and it's very, very important to continue with this real history against that myth of a big brother. The second point is ideological and political, and there I think the connections are the most serious. There, again, we have to start with the 19th century. And we have to talk about the so-called narodnjaštvo, the Russian populism that started in 19th century. And Serbian politicians were very well connected with narodnjaci, especially the leaders of the Radical Party. So it's important to say that the leader of the Radical Party in Serbia, Nikola Pašić, was totally under the influence of Russian populists, and he was the leader of Serbia for 50 years. So not only Serbia, but also the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. So we can say that the whole political scene in the Kingdom of Serbia at the turn of centuries and Yugoslavia was under the very strong influence of Russian populism. And I think the best way that was described is the title of the book written by the best Serbian historian, Latinka Perović, and the title is Russian Originals and Serbia Replicas. And her statement is that Serbia, in fact, was kind of a, as she said, a Russian ideological colony. So what am I talking about now? I'm talking about the very specific concept of the state and politics, which is called narodna država, the people's state. So this is the main idea of Russian populism, and this is something that we have in continuity in different phases, whether it was during the empire, during communist time, during Putin. So they're all talking about the people's state, where, of course, the big leader is saying what the people thinks. So he is just the transmitter of people's thoughts. Of course, when we have such a system, there is no place for the people, that's clear. We are, in fact, talking about the party state. And this is the biggest similarity between Russia and Serbia, then and now, where the party, the ruling party, is above all the institutions, above the rule of law, above the law itself. So everything is controlled by the ruling party. And the ideology that is behind those groups and those populists is, of course, anti-pluralistic, anti-liberal, and very anti-Western. So those are those connections from which we can then analyze the relations with the West, with the European Union, etc. But those are the bases that from which different systems in the left and in the right, from Nikola Pašić to Aleksandar Vučić, who are not, of course, the same, but they are very similar in some basic political values and ways of functioning. So that's why we can talk about a long continuity, a long durée of a specific political culture that comes from that kind of ideology that is created. Because if we look, for example, history of Serbia, the 20th century, we can say that everything happened here. So we had small kingdom of Serbia, then we had a kingdom of Yugoslavia, then we had a revolution, then we had the Yugoslavia as a federation and the socialist state. And then again, we are a small Republic of Serbia. We had local wars, we had civil wars, we had occupation, so we had everything. But then, if you compare Aleksandar Vučić to Nikola Pašić, you can see very, very similar ways of governing, ideas, and those very, very strong continuities. And I think that those are the deepest similarities that comes of where Russia was the inspiration, let's say, and still is. And of course, this is the way we are living today.
Thank you, Dubravka. This was succinct. Sergey, I'll let you throw the first punch on anything that you think is wrong.
Yeah.
but only the first time.
Yeah, I will follow actually the similarities pattern, even though in, let's say, Russian liberal political culture, these similarities were consequently denied, because for the many, many years, Russian liberals and a lot of Western experts praised Russia for avoiding what was called Yugoslav scenario. The bloodless dissolution of the Soviet Union was sort of a fetish. And this was the absolutely non-critical approach, because from what we see now, we can say that actually it's the same pattern as the whole group or interconnected series of Yugoslav wars, but being shown in a slow motion. It took it like 30 years instead of 1 decade, but more or less it's the same pattern taken in total. I can recall the year of 1995. I was 14 years old. What we've seen actually in our television, we've seen the very clear pictures of the very recognizable socialist buildings being hit by the tank shells. And sometimes it was not possible to recognize if it happens in the former Yugoslavia or it happens in Chechnya, because architecture, mountainous landscape, the same Soviet-built tanks were absolutely the same. And it's very, it's what we do not like to remember. In the summer of 1995, when the Srebrenica massacre took place, the same year was the heat of the first Russian invasion to Chechnya. There was no one single crime comparable to Srebrenica, but taken in their entirety, it was the same pattern of violence. And the division line was, of course, as in case of Bosnia and Herzegovina, these were the people of the other faith. This was the Christian versus Muslim population, mostly in case of Chechnya. When we go now to the war of Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine, we can clearly, maybe not everybody will like this comparison, compared with the case of Serbia versus Croatia. Because what Russian propaganda basically says about Ukrainians, they are the same folk as we, but they've been exposed to these dangerous Western influences, and they became sort of perverted Russians due to the influence of the Catholic Church, due to their closeness to the Western borders. And this is actually the ideology behind the conquest. The claim of similarity gives the chance to justify invasion, and the blame for being perverted of this perversion justifies the violence. And coming back again to the 90s, I think that the main key thing was also all time overlooked both by Russians and Westerners. Of course, is the question of the nuclear power. Because imagine Russia in the 90s without the nuclear umbrella. It would be perfectly possible for the West to exercise its influence on absolutely different scale. Maybe even sometimes, economical sanctions whatsoever. But not only Russia was given this credit of democratic hope, absolutely baselessly. Of course, everybody knew that Russia is weak, Russia is economically weak, but still Russia has its nuclear arsenal. And therefore, somewhere in our, let's say, cultural mindset, due to the nuclear arsenal, we have this very strong feeling and notion of impunity, what you can do with us. Okay, you can invade somewhere on the periphery, but it will not be any sort of full-scale invasion. You cannot punish us the way, I don't know, Gaddafi was punished. And I pretty believe that it's not just a feeling on those who are on the top. I'm pretty much sure that it's also the feeling of the soldiers now on Ukrainian front line. They can be killed, they can be whatsoever, but in general, Russia couldn't be punished. And this is, of course, the huge difference between Russian and Serbian cases. But what I would like also to underline, of course, the shared anti-Americanism or anti-Westernism is the basement for this maybe not willing but also all time existing alliance. The very symbolical turn in Russian post-Soviet politics when Foreign Minister Primakov turned his plane over the Atlantic Ocean when he got the news about the NATO bombings of Belgrade, this was symbolical move of Russia from US, from America, from Europe to its own. And it's very closely linked to what was going on in Serbia. So maybe even not willingly, as I said, but the cause of events in Balkans very heavily shaped the Russian foreign and internal policy and gave the impact or gave the symbolical significance for what was Russia doing. And of course, I would say that, okay, I can recall what was going on in the 90s. Of course, it was a lot of feeling of, hurting national pride. We have lost the Cold War, whatsoever. And only shining moment in this supposed darkness was the moment when the Russian paratroopers took over the Pristina airport earlier than the UN peacekeepers arrived there. It was so much dramatized, absolutely not in a proportion with the real cause of the events. It was everywhere for years and years. They did this, they did it, but our paratroopers won this rush to the airport. Absolutely unbelievable. But it really shows how much this, let's say, offended sensibilities are shared. Mm-hmm. It's not a national alliance. It's not forged due to the, any sort of diplomatic agreements. But this is the alliance of supposed losers, I would say. But they prescribe the status of losers themselves by themselves, because it's very strange. I mean, it's not the Serbian cause, I think, but in the 90s, West invested so much in Russia, giving the bank credits, providing the food. We should not forget, for example, that for 2 or 3 years, Russia was critically dependent on the food deliveries from the West. But then it was immediately forgotten, and no sense of gratitude was ever expressed, even though we knew that West was really open and embracing Russia. So,
okay, I need to.
Yeah, please do.
Okay. Do you have an immediate response or?
Do you have a question?
I always do.
So let's see what's better.
Okay. As good pupils, Imperial legacy is the. I've heard today probably 15 to 20 times Russian imperialism. How is Russian imperialism different from? Is it different from other imperialisms? And if so, how?
You, and then I will follow.
Whomever.
Well, it is different, and somehow, and funnily, it's comparable to the American one, because other European empires, they took territories all around the world, but Russia and US, they made their empires in the neighborhood. So Russia going east and US going west. So this is very important. And this is similar to Serbia, because Of course, Serbia didn't invade anything in Africa, but she did somehow colonize the Balkans. This is how Serbia felt. So the narrative was very similar. We are liberating everybody. We are going to give them freedom. We are going to give them education, culture, etc., etc. So if we analyze that kind of narrative, Serbian narrative in the end of the 19th century, the narrative of liberation and unification, that's very similar to other empires. And I think this is very important what Sergey said, the alliance of losers. And even more, the alliance of lost empires. So from that traumatized historical consciousness, they created revanchism, as Bechlin would say. Where is he? He's not here.
Okay.
He has this thesis of...
Thank you. But I'll add, I mean, today, how is Russian imperialism today different from other imperialisms? Russia is also taking care of its security threats. It's also protecting minorities. This is the discourse of humanitarian intervention and of security issues that is employed by other big players.
Well, but I think that the difference is that the purpose of the war. So the purpose of the war in Russia, in Ukraine, and the Serbian war against its neighbors was to take territories. It's a very old-fashioned war. So I think that this is the main similarity. So when we have the American intervention in Iraq, they want to change the government and they want to control that country through the imposed government. This is kind, of course, of imperialism. But they're not going to take this territory, which will become the 51st state of US. And Ukraine is supposed to become Russia, like Bosnia or like parts of Croatia. So I think that there is a huge difference there. And this is why I think that those wars in Ukraine and in ex-Yugoslavia are completely comparable, that we are talking about the same war, with the same aims and with same arguments that we can compare later.
Thank you.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, when we are talking about Russia's war against Ukraine, it has at least 300 years of historical background of abuse, which was coming only from the Russian side. It's not something that happened really now. It has a long historical tradition of Russia's abuse behind. And as Dubravka pointed absolutely correctly, all the explanations about Russian language rights or whatsoever are just a smokescreen for ownership of the territory, for ownership of the resources. Let's remember what we were all talking the last year. It was the talk about grain. As in the 20th century, the grain is essential. The fertile soil of Ukraine is essential. And we can, on one hand, pose this war as the war of ideological nature, but behind the ideology lies, of course, the real, very simple interest. Also because Ukraine owns all the vital lines of trade of Russia and the West. I mean, gas pipelines, oil pipelines, they go through Ukraine. And unfortunately, we should really understand that ideology and economy, they're here together.
You agree too much to the point that you're almost gang up on me. Okay.
Almost.
Almost. If that is the case, you mentioned like there was a perception that Russia avoided Yugoslav scenario, but then 30 years after, we are having pretty much the same scenario. Now, why this 30 years? Why not immediately?
We are the avant-garde.
Yeah.
Why the gap?
Yeah.
Why not? Why now?
I think the correct answer, the correct question is not just why not simultaneously, because Russia started in Transnistria region in 1992, It's all, I mean, conflict in Abkhazia, conflict in Ossetia, it's 1992, 1993. But they're really too far away from each other to be perceived as a part of one ongoing policy. And of course, with the first Chechen war, with the first invasion, it was sort of integrity of the Russian Federation on stake. And it took Russia really 20 years to rebuild, to build effective military economy, and then to go for its bigger neighbors. It's a sort of, it wouldn't have been possible, for example, for Russia to engage with Ukraine in 1994. Ukraine was still a nuclear power. It only took Budapest Memorandum, yeah, and it only took a lot of years because Ukraine was one of the most heavily armed parts of the Soviet Union. All the Soviet forces were gathered there for the supposed attack from the West. It took a lot of time for Ukraine to disarm, and it took a lot of period for Russia to arm itself. But when it arrived to a certain point, the preparation started. I just want to pinpoint one thing. One of the first projects Putin's launched was the GLONASS system, which is a Russian alternative to the GPS, crucial for all conducting the military warfare in the modern world. It was made very early, and all these Russian missiles which are now raging over Ukraine is a direct result of this long time preparations.
Dubravka, do you see anything else that you would like to add to this rather one-dimensional picture? Within this period, apart from Russian preparations, nothing else happened. Ukraine shifts in policy towards from east to west, NATO policy of expansion, situation with minorities. You think that these events are inconsequential?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I would say it's a victim blaming. No, these events are not consequential. The only real trigger for Putin, of course, was the first Maidan, when he realized that this neighboring country could serve as a bad example for Russia. This was really the case. And for many years, Russia tried to directly interfere in Ukrainian election policy. This was the case, but the preparations were made early.
Okay, I promised the second part about the peace. I would like you to wrap up on what's the situation today? Before we talk about the peace, where do you see Russia and Serbia today and tomorrow? Are they still European countries, or are we talking about reimagining Europe in a sense? Can we function without Europe and Europe without Russia? Without Serbia properly, but without Russia, it's a genuine question. So, Dubravka, would you like to go first?
Well, talking about those wars and those similarities and differences, of course, I think that it's also important to say that, for example, for Serbia and for Yugoslav wars, but maybe it's the same situation for Russia. The way that those elites, corrupted elites, control politics and financial funds is through nationalism. So nationalism is a tool, it's not the goal, because why would Russia need Donbass? I mean, it's the largest country in the world. Why would Russia need that small part that took in 2014? So even when we are talking about territories, that's funny in Russian. It was more serious in ex-Yugoslavia because that was the idea of Serbia getting out of the Adriatic Sea, etc., some fantasies. But for Russia, I mean, it means nothing. So I think that we should dig deeper, and that the main aim of those wars, in fact, is a political control, is a total corruption of the society without any control. It's a control of finances. And the main game for Serbia is not to enter European Union. And these days, I'm thinking a lot about our meeting in Sofia. And do you remember that that was the time that it looked that Vučić signed something in Ohrid with Kosovo? That was end of February. And Martin said that it's over, that Vučić signed. And I said, never. Do you remember that? Because the aim of Serbia is not to enter EU. And I'm absolutely sure that that was the part of the motive of Yugoslav wars, not to change the control. Absolutely. So look what he's doing now. He's making the war in Kosovo. He sent paramilitaries there and the army at the frontiers against NATO. Why is he? Does he really think that the army will get in there? No. The main purpose is not to enter. For Vučić, like for Milosevic, the best thing in the world, as for Putin, is to have sanctions. Nothing better. They can control the situation totally. The population will be more poor every day. The population will be completely lost. So he can even control the situation even better. And the total isolation and sanctions, that's what Vučić wishes now.
Okay, so today and tomorrow, Serbia is not in the EU and Vučić is still in power.
Of course, forever.
Sergey, one of the heroes of your book says at the beginning, I never felt more European. Now, this is not a personal question. Russia has been shifting back and forth for centuries. Is Russia still a European country, and what it will be tomorrow?
First, I think I would like to shortly comment on what Dubravka said. We started these talks today with the topic of ni vida, never again. I wanted to add this earlier, but I will say it now, and it's very, very important. Around 2010, under the presidency of what we call the iPhone president, Lebedev, the very strange and illustrative motto appeared in Russia as one of the main signals of propaganda, but it was also widely repeated by the citizens. Every 15th car in Moscow had this, small poster on it. The motto was "Можем повторить," which means we can do it again, we can repeat. Absolutely clearly challenging European ni vida. And this is what happens when the victor of the World War II really emphasizes its militancy. And this was the clear signal that something is brewing within the society, because this motto was not enforced. People were not forced, to put these posters, mainly on their German cars. So we can do it again. It's a bizarre thing, because people were explicitly talking about we can go through the World War II again. And when today people share their personal experiences of how they were raised in the socialist countries with an idea that the war should never be repeated, I've also been raised in a socialist country, and I also recall this stuff. But I do believe that the socialists and the communists were really half-hearted in this policy. So now, with this motto, already in 2010, Russia clearly alienated itself from Europe in its very in the very core of European project. And also talking in Vienna, I emphasized another point. I mean, Russia is now really going back in time, with every day and every month becoming more and more archaic and brutal in its political culture, in its decisions. I mean, the war Russia is waging against Ukraine is modern in terms of the warfare, But in terms of how this war is conducted and in terms why this war already happened, it's the Stalin's 20th century mindset behind this. And therefore, I think that EU and Russia are really going and traveling in different directions in time. EU is trying to go, at least in some future, and Russia is trying to avoid future and come back to the real imperial period of its own history. So unfortunately, Russia and Europe really have nothing, very few things in common today.
Thank you. Personally, I'm not particularly thrilled by this, neither this, return to the past or this, attempt for the future at how it looks. Okay, let's try to talk about peace. Okay.
Let's.
I will read a few questions, and as this previous hour showed, you will respond to what you prefer, not to what you've been asked. How do we achieve peace? When and how this war ends? Zelensky peace plan and the UN calls are based on the withdrawal of Russian troops. With all the ongoing bloody conflicts for almost 2 years, this scenario is hard to achieve through Ukrainian military crushing of the Russian war machine and its expulsion from Ukraine. Similarly, Russia cannot militarily crush and overrun Ukraine. This war is being waged on a 1,000-kilometer front, equivalent to the distance from Budapest to Thessaloniki or from Paris to Berlin, just to compare the geography. There seems to be no end in sight. Where is the end of this war? How do you envision it? What comes at its end and what comes after it? Western policy, initially explicit and now seemingly implicit, has been, to quote Macron, that Ukraine must be the victor, but Russia must not be defeated. I think I understand the logic of this reasoning, but I'm not sure what it actually means. War is costly, but so is peace. And peace has its price, painful and high. What kind of peace awaits us, and what kind of peace do we need? When and how do we reach it? Okay, pick whatever you want, but please tell me something about peace for the next 20 minutes.
Well, I'll try. Well, the first question is, do we want the peace? So this is the crucial question. And I think that ex-Yugoslav peoples show that they do not want the peace. Not peoples, but their elites. And that the peace is not in the interest of political elites in today's states that came out of Yugoslavia. Because if we look, not in Slovenia these days, but from Croatia to Macedonia, the political elites that led the war are still there. From HDZ in Croatia to Naprednjaci, not to talk about Bosnia. So it's 28 years after the end of the war. And it's more than it's 32 years after the beginning of the war. So the war ended. In Serbia, it ended brutally with NATO intervention. But the war is not over because it stayed in narratives, it stayed in memory, and it stayed there because it's the interest of political elites to refresh the conflict every now and then. This is how they rule. And we can go back to populists. We can go back to that kind of state that needs different glues, and the nationalism is the best glue for that kind of government. So look what they are doing. Each year around Srebrenica, the commemoration in Srebrenica, each year around the commemoration of Oluja in Croatia, we are in front of the new war. We are not 30 years later. No, we are expecting the new war. This is how our leaders are acting, because they need all those dramatic emotions for their corruption, for the control of media, for the control of everything in those countries. So the question is how to change that situation in order to get to completely new political elites that will have peace as the value, as the main political aim. As we can see now in Bosnia, even in Montenegro, not to talk about Kosovo, we are in front of the new war. And this is what they want. I mean, it's only thanks to NATO and thanks to those different international armies that are in Bosnia and Kosovo that we have kind of peace today. So we have to think why, and I think the answer is that the peace, like European integrations, are not in the interest of ruling elites.
Thank you. Yeah, I will pick from exactly this moment. In late autumn 2013, Putin's approval ratings were on the lowest point throughout all his time of all his presidencies. And it was clear that he is about to lose not the power, but influence exercised. But when the Crimea was annexed, the sociologists picked up the very interesting fact that first time in, the whole period of his reign, at least 8 or 10% of those who approved him never did this before. So with one strike, he got at least 10% plus for his approval ratings. And unfortunately, now we are really in a deadlock because Russia has resources and protection to wage war as long as it wants it to last. How, actually, with what political or cultural or diplomatical means you can force a nuclear power to stop the war? The answer is only when it exhausts its resources. There is no other means.
That's what we were hoping for years, but it doesn't happen. There is no end.
And I think that there are situations, very unfortunate, very grim, when we are misled by our feeling that every situation has a solution right now, but we simply cannot find it. I'm pretty much sure that for now, there is no such a solution. And peace as a sustainable condition, peace as a transformation of Russia into the safe neighbor for its neighbors, is something we can desire, but we do not have a practical roadmap how to achieve. And vice versa, of course, it's not just the Russian population who is getting adjusted to the war. It's a very new strata of the society is emerging. Again, it's so-called war veterans, their families, their children, whatsoever, and they're growing stronger and larger. And with what leverage, with what forces they can be removed from the position of power in any possible scenario, I honestly do not know. I only can say that the peace would be the question of who will outweigh whom. And unfortunately, Mr. Putin is quite a master of waiting. He's seen presidents coming and going. He's seen different generations of European politicians, like clouds in the sky, and he's still there. And therefore, his resource is time. And his resource is a real control over the political situation in Russia, while, of course, the unity of the European nations backing Ukraine. We all seen the results of elections in Slovakia. It will start to erode, it will start to corrode. And I would say that our first focus on the way to peace is the idea of solidarity in patience or patience in solidarity. This is the only thing which can guarantee victory and peace in the long run. But in the short run, it's a bit of a Churchill situation. I cannot offer you anything really optimistic like right now. There is no decision of this sort.
And when Sergey mentioned veterans as a new power group, we should also talk about criminals, because those states are totally criminalized, and the war again and sanctions are absolutely the paradise for that kind of state criminal and organized criminal. So they will not give up. Look what we have. I mean, those criminals that we have in the government, they came from the war of the 90s. That's where they became rich. Look, this Radojic guy and the palaces that he has, etc., etc. So this is also very important, not strata or social group. They own the state. So we are living in criminalized state. So as Gingic said, the question is not whether, how did he say, whether the state has criminals, but when criminals have the state.
Every state has its criminals, but only in our country criminals have the state.
Okay,
have their own state.
that's So this is also very important to have in mind, and that's why the war is a perfect context for that.
Do you have anything to add on the Ukrainian scenario from the Balkan perspective? What's the price of peace? Can you imagine it? You don't know, but can you, is there anything you would?
I must say, I really don't know. And it's very difficult, as Sergey just said. But I'm very frightened by one signal, I must say. I was all around Europe for last almost 2 years since the beginning of the war. And each time when I met Ukrainian colleagues, they said more or less the same thing. And the thing was, I will not talk to Russians. They're all the same. We should not ever, never again talk with them. So maybe that was a wrong, somehow the wrong experience that I had. But I had that experience all around Europe. I had it last week in Prushka Gora. I had it in Paris. I had it everywhere. And I'm very afraid because of that. I have the impression that that kind of self-victimization is something that rules against future Ukrainian society and democracy. The only thing I say to them every time is that we started to cooperate with our Croatian colleagues during the war. We had a lot of colleagues and we started to analyze the narratives, the ways that history is misused during the war. And that's when we built the not only partnership, but also friendship and mutual understanding. So, and that's what I'm saying to them all the time. You have to find your Russian colleagues and start to talk immediately, because you have to prepare your future societies. If you start from the point that you will never talk to Russians, this is the end. They're all the same. 140 million people are the same. Then this is the problem for the Ukrainian society. And this is something that I'm afraid of. Even a very close friend of mine, Slavenka Drakulic, who is radical, she said, I will never go to future conferences with Ukrainians. You can't talk to them at all. She's Croatian, but she was anti-war oriented during the war when Croatia was bombed. So this is the position that we need also from Ukraine in order to build a sustainable peace.
Yeah, but I would also like to comment. I can perfectly understand the position of Ukrainian colleagues, not only because of what they feel, what happened to their families or their beloved ones on the front line. Unfortunately, for many, many years, since 2014, a huge, I would say even majority, the Russian liberal intellectuals had a tendency not to pay attention to what is going on. There was no real, serious, organized anti-war expression or movement whatsoever when it was still possible. And only when the open invasion started, people like awakened. Oh, we have a war. And I still quite frequently hear from my colleagues, I mean Russian colleagues, when the war started in 2022, I think that the first precondition for these possible talks is that we, I mean the Russians, should make something clear about us themselves. We should make the first step, acknowledging our faults, our blindness, our unwillingness to make this few steps
Yeah, but what
forward.
about Memorial, for example?
Nothing. I mean, what about Memorial? Memorial was never actually really anti-war movement. And Memorial, unfortunately, is one of those to be blamed for the failed transit of 80s and 90s, because it was a very clear politics of Memorial to deny any measures of transitional justice. Memorial was for commemoration of victims, and they publicly said that any measures of transitional justice is the witch hunt. So, and after 30 years, they never criticized themselves for this. So there is a lot of job to be done on the Russian side, and I don't see any willingness to do the job.
Not even in independent media, the people that are in Europe, that are immigrants.
People who are in Europe and who are immigrants investing an enormous amount of resources into defense of the Russian culture and their positions and whatsoever. I really do not see how this self-critical approach could form, because what I see is that what we have now is a really well formulated bad habit to criticize any Ukrainian decision and act offensively without really admitting that we have a guilt and responsibility. When this talk will start and it will be tangible, I'm pretty much sure that Ukrainian side will fill it.
But they can talk to you first.
They can. Okay. I mean, and they see they can, and they see what's going on.
Okay, thank you. This was insightful and pretty dynamic, in my view. Many of these people have been here for 8 straight hours. I think they deserve 30 minutes of discussion.
Yeah, they do.
Well, yeah, the 8 hours were so excited that this conference voice to the end is becoming more and more energetic. We're not ready to go home yet. I really enjoyed the debate, and I would like to ask a question and then also having just few comments in this wonderful meeting that were raised here. So, Dubravka, I think it's a little bit of exaggeration to say that in the whole region, the elites and the political class, they want the war, that they want nationalism and things like that. So it is that in different countries, it's really a fight. So in North Macedonia, in Montenegro, in Bulgaria, we see that very often the political battle is very tight. And then what you were referring to, I would like to widen that as far because the problem is that big corruption in society, clientelism, and then this goes even in a country with a slow, not just hybrid democracy, which means that at the end it is the problem to bring elites that will take care of the public interest the way like Western Europe is doing. My question is why in Serbia the society of the political actors who are not part of this authoritarian and corrupt and criminalized elite settle at least with why there's so much marginalized 20 years back. So I can assume that this brutal power of Putin is crushing. And then we have different authoritarian regimes here as well. We experience that to a certain extent in North Macedonia. We see what Orban is doing in Hungary and things like that. The question is, what can, if you can eventually tell about, can the society and the normal political actors to counterfight strong majoritarian regimes? Then the second question for you would be, I totally agree that nationalism is now more true, but we can see that there is a real catastrophe when it comes to provoking a war. Of course, the regime can do a lot of sacrifice from people. Sometimes what Putin is doing with own people is really terrible, but then this kind is happening in Ukraine. It's really something of another scale. So my question for you is, do you really see that this Putin crossing the line of war can now have reverse that, but really can reverse effect on the actual Serbian authority to actually enter in some kind of conflict in Kosovo? And do you also think that anywhere in Europe can this Putinization and Putinophobia cause the autocratic and populist elites to also cross the line? So far, we can see they are using nationalism too. But do you think that this can eventually change?
Thank you. We will stay until 11.
Yeah, you asked more questions than I did. Can you respond in like a couple of minutes, or you want to get with the question?
I don't know what you say. Let's take all the questions. What
You're
you
the boss.
say? No, you are the boss.
No, thank you.
Okay, very short question. First of all, congrats. I fully enjoyed the discussion, and I also confirm that we have a lot of intellectual energy coming from you. Still, one question about, for both of you, the responsibility of critical left-wing oriented intellectuals in our societies, mainly in Serbia and Russia or Russian diaspora, right? I mean, we are confronted with a clear crisis of the left-wing, let's say, intellectual movements. And we know that the anti-imperialist, anti-colonial, decolonial attitudes have been hijacked by populist and pro-Russian, pro-Kremlin narratives. For example, I am from Romania, and I will give the example in Romania. Soon after the beginning of the war in Ukraine, a lot of left-wing oriented intellectuals started to discuss about the breach of minority rights of the Romanian community in Ukraine, practically just criticizing and bringing mistrust in Ukraine. And this was combined, of course, with the idea of Western imperialism and the fact that we are being actually brainwashed about the events in Ukraine, it's all fake and all that. So in this context, what is exactly the responsibility of a critical intellectual who still wants to hold to the facts and present an anti-imperialist, anti-colonial perspective, but without feeding into the Russian narrative?
Yes, please.
Thank you very much for your deep insights and very interesting parallels. I have to admit it. I'm deeply impressed by the first parallel made about the historical failure that Serbia actually got from the Russian side, from the first Serbian uprisal to the First World War. And then I started to think when this very famous sentence of Gilas, who said, Tsarist Russia didn't understood us. But you can actually continue these lists from like Second World War, 48, even today. I think that Serbian nationalists are failed because Putin didn't storm Ukraine and revenge for this. Well, this idea, it's very interesting, and I think that it completely fits with the idea of Latinka Perović about Russia as a Serbian intellectual and ideological colony. But the problem that this intellectual colony doesn't really work is the best thing, because when we look back in this interwar period, the greatest Russian idea of Russian religious philosophy, God manhood, integral knowledge, sobornos, all unity, were appropriated and very creatively transformed is something which doesn't have any ideological sense. Now I'm trying to figure out if we intellectually are not inferior towards Russian, and we have very clear kind of historical data of these failures. What is the nature of this mystical or mythological attachment of Serbian elites to Russia? What is kind of so appealing about it? And I would say now, this is the first question for Professor Stojanović. The second question for our colleague. I just came from Bulgaria from one meeting with our Russian colleagues who cannot travel to Europe. And I noticed something, I think it's very dangerous. And this is especially those who are coming to Europe and who are very critical of Russian politics today, and especially the things happening in Ukraine, but who are at the same time, for certain peace, ready to compromise the best ideas which Russian philosophical mind born in the 19th century. I'm saying that for the reason you probably know that there are kind of several books in early 2000, 2010 and 2000. Can you wrap it up, please? Right, okay. I'm saying why we are throwing a newborn baby with a bath water, why we are actually the best of Russian religious philosophy throwing out in order to accommodate, to show that these ideas are not something we are supporting because Putin is using this as kind of ideological tools. That's something. Thank you.
Well, no one did.
My name is Vladimir Cvetković. I'm working at the Institute of Philosophy and Social Theory. This is my, working on Russian religious philosophy. That's my topic of interest. Thank you.
Did we have one more and that's it? Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me try to answer all those questions together somehow. Especially the Robert's question, what about the opposition, and also your question about where is the left and where is the political space for the left. Well, it's of course quite complicated, but let's start with the fact that the Serbian opposition against Milosevic was more nationalistic than he was. So we had the right-wing position of Milosevic and the extreme right-wing position of the most of the opposition. So there was one party, Građanski Savez, who got maybe 2 to 3%, which was the anti-war party. So the whole political space was hijacked by nationalists. And this is what we lived not only for 30 years, we lived for 40 years. It started just after Tito's death. So that fight, who is a greater nationalist? They criticized Milosevic, saying that he is not leading the right war, that he doesn't know to lead the war, that they would do it better. So in that situation, what we see now is that even the left-wing green parties, etc., they are afraid to say anything different. For example, we have this scandal at Kosovo and this terrorist attack organized obviously by a Serbian state. I didn't hear any political party saying it openly because they are afraid, because the whole political space is hijacked for 40 years with the nationalistic narrative. And there, when you say that that those are criminals, that this was a criminal act, that this is a terrorism, you are really endangered, physically endangered, not only politically. So this is one of the dangers, that we don't have any political space anymore, especially for the left. Left is not fighting for its political space. They are also kind of what to say, but let's say they're somehow also the part of this corrupted political scene in which finally everything is fine and there are no serious criticism except for, of course.
Just out of curiosity, when a Palestinian shoots an Israeli soldier in Gaza, is that terrorism?
Do you think this is the same situation when you have a NATO in Kosovo and then the Serbian army enters there? Is that the same situation?
I'm asking.
Well, I think that the Israeli policeman is a terrorist in West Coast, for example. I think this is a colonization of West Coast, for example. Okay, this is what I think. I think that this was a terrorist attack thanks to the Serbian government, but there are no voices like this. So how could they been so well armed? Where does that come from? How could they enter Kosovo without the help of Serbian state? So this is the situation, and this is why Vučić is creating those situations. So how can you say anything against in a situation that can erase the war tomorrow? So this is why he is creating those situations. And obviously about the mystical attachment to Russia, it would be much better that you answer them than I do.
I don't see the nature, I don't see the ratio behind. Sometimes the people who are better intellectual standing by ideas were lost. That convincing, that's something what is my point. And I'm trying to push. And this is not, I think that this is not on the kind of on one ideological spectrum. If you look on Russia was the for many Serbian Christians, and Brad Roshka was also a deal for many Serbian Romans, and there's a logical whole. But even in this, I thought that it's always in the sense that it's not happening today, that Russia is failing us because somebody actually stole the true Russia, which will raise and lead. That's something I'm thinking about.
Okay.
Okay, I will pick up the question of responsibility of intellectual and we try to combine it with the question about religious philosophers being thrown out. I think that we, as the Russian, I don't know, intellectual society, we really failed this 30 years we had, and we failed them in a very specific way. The imperial/colonial nature of the Soviet rule is the lessest researched field of all what is related to the Soviet past. In the same time, of course, we all got some privileges from the fact that we belong to this sort of a big, high status culture. So we were not able, in effect, to go against our practical interests and to really deconstruct what Russia was and what Russia is and why Russia was acting as she acted in the 90s since the first invasion in Chechnya. Because invasion in Chechnya, which also had a long record of abuse since the 19th century, was actually described as a sort of historical coincidence, historical mistake. It's just the ship ran off the course, but it was never given the proper intellectual context and background. And therefore, now, in the Russian intellectual community as well, there are many voices claiming, no, the Russian war against Ukraine is not colonial, it's not imperial whatsoever. But it's only because of the real illiteracy regarding what relations had Russia and Ukraine for centuries. We must say we are really illiterate. And we failed for these 30 years to analyze what sort of, bad tendencies the Russian culture contains within itself. Because you can go far away in the 19th century, in the 20th century, except Alexander Herzen, I think, you will not find one single figure who would be really pro-secessionist, I would say, who would really stand for defense of the oppressed nations. All the others, bright minds, not bright minds, they are a bit of irrelevant in the current situation. They cannot offer any real knowledge of understanding because they were the same imperialists, unfortunately. Both whites and reds were in a bitter struggle, but they were both imperialists in the fact, in the end of the day. So we are in a way in the position when we really need to reestablish and reinvent a lot of things in one moment. But the situation is, but the easiest way out of the situation, of course, is self-defense, is claiming that no, Russian culture is innocent. Russian culture is so pristine and so bright and so intellectual that it cannot contain these tendencies. And I really feel how many of my colleagues stick to this. This is the field of responsibility, but I'm clearly sure that we even didn't arrive to the point where you acknowledge this responsibility.
We had some more questions, I think.
Thank you. The point I have might be both hopeful and extremely grim. And it's one thing that I always miss in these debates about how could this possibly end, and that is what will happen within Russia, right? And I think with Prigozhin's mutiny, we had like a small hint that this could also end extremely badly with violent disintegration. And so I put the question back to you, Sergey, like what might happen within Russia that will help end the war against Ukraine, but might also make the situation further dangerous?
Thank you very much for this really interesting discussion. I will use this opportunity as one of organizers just to mention a literary work of Sergey Lebedev, and okay, you can see also his books here, and were brought from Zagreb, because unfortunately we don't have translation to Serbian, but only in Croatian, but we can read these books. And the price is like 1,800 dinars. But I would like to put question regarding your literature. I haven't read your books. I will, but when I Googled and read interviews with you, I understood that you are in your books exploring Russia's imperialism through these family stories. You see, it would be for us very interesting to understand what you discovered in your personal search about Russia's imperialism. What is so particular, or is it some? You think that there is nothing particular in that, or what did this your research bring to you? What did you find out?
May I also say something, or should I wait for the next round?
Shall we finish at 8?
Yeah.
Huh? I think we are planning to finish at 8. Therefore, we don't intend to have another round.
Okay. I just wanted to stay for a moment with what Dubravka said at the very end, and I think it's a super important point, and probably a point which can be heard at this time only in Serbia, and that relates to we don't want to talk with. We are not talking with. And I was thinking also related to the previous panel, I mean, what the Europe can learn from 30 years onwards. So my youngest sister was in New York City last year, and she saw a graffiti on the wall, "All Russians are guilty." She was born in '93. And that means that, you know, when she reached her teenage state of life, I mean, all wars were over already. But when she saw that graffiti, she felt very bad. And that was, I guess, one of the most potent impressions after seeing New York, that all Russians are guilty. So you might wonder why a Serbian girl born in '93 would have felt that way, but she did. And I think that one of the very important things about the generation born in Serbia during the wars, or even after the wars, maybe even more so after the wars, is that identification, maybe absolutely unwanted identification with being Serbian. If for their parents that meant something in the '90s during the war, when they had to choose how to refer to themselves, for the children, it's much more vague. And I'm thinking really, you know, the fact that we are born somewhere is as contingent as the fact that we are born in this body or that body. I mean, it's like being born is something absolutely out of choice. So when you say, Sergey, that the Russians today are not choosing to really contextualize, see, react, and all of what you said, I of course I agree. This is exactly what also Miruna asked me. How do we respond? How do we react? Where's our agency? But at the same time, you know, if you say, I don't speak to you, all of you are guilty, that is really also stopping agency. It's denying agency. It's, you know, you would disagree. Perfect. Please do so.
Okay. But shall we do it by the order of questions? I think
I think
there were more questions for Sergey. And
yeah.
What might happen within Russia? That was the,
That
was the question.
Yeah. Okay. To make the long story short, I think we say Russia. What is Russia? Russia is supposed to be the federation which is not really a federation. It's rather a homogeneous state with the latest percentage around 80% of population conceive themselves to be the Russians. The minorities are the 20%. But what I see now in the cultural sphere, and the people with the double identities are switching from being Russian speakers, Russian writers, Russian, I don't know, poets or artists. They retreat to what have been their native languages, native cultures. And actually, maybe this 80% of those, they also consist of those who choose to be the Russians because it was a favorable situation to do so. But the only real energy and life within the, under the repressive regime, what I see now, is this slow emerging movement into the national cultures. Because the very situation of war and the situation of Ukrainians experience now give those, I don't know, Tatars, Buryats, Chechens, Yakuts, chance first time for many, many years to claim the agency and the history of abuse. This really hurts Russian liberal intellectuals. They do not want to acknowledge this. But if we are talking about some potentials, like in electricity, the potential is there. The potential is there. And I do know and feel that this is the movement happening now. The question about literature, I will tell a very short story. It's not about me writing, it's about me meeting the other writers. It's what your books drive you in. I've been in Sweden, in the island of Gotland, where the Baltic Center for Writers and Translators work. It was 11 of us in the first days of the second Maidan, 11 writers from the different European countries. And once upon, we shared the table for the dinner, and we started to talk about the family's history. And all other 10 coming from the different countries had in their family terrible record of abuse by Soviet Union / Russia. And I was sitting there knowing that probably my grandparent, who'd been the officer of the Red Army, is the symbolic figure in this different stories from Finland to Romania. And this was the lesson given to me by the books I wrote. They brought me into the situation. And it was a really life-changing moment when I understood the deepness of this record of abuse. When I realized that I cannot live pretending it never happened. I cannot not question my own parents, grandparents, whatsoever. And this is the best what literature can give you. The chance to really understand what the others are feeling. Not talking point, I mean, my point is also very clear. I'm not really concerned about being cancelled or about this. We will not speak policy. Because as a Russian, I can only say that we should acknowledge certain things first. It's up to you to talk with Ukrainians about this. It's up to you to convince, to make a diplomacy. Up to me is only to make this very strong point. If I am becoming the agent of this diplomacy, oh, please talk with us. It's ethically wrong position, and I will not take it.
This day has been slightly dominated by men, and I'm glad that the last round of questions was mainly from women, and that you have the closing word for this.
Oh. No. I just want to answer to what Adriana said, because I fully agree. And I remember I was very young and I was in anti-war movement in Belgrade, and it was dangerous sometimes. And everybody was against those little groups of women screaming against the war. And then I went to Paris to the library to work something there in the library. And there was a guy who asked me where I'm from. And then I said, I'm from Serbia. And he said, oh. So that was the moment that you're talking about, where you're completely alone in the world. So you are alone within your country and you are perceived as a Serbian fascist from outside. So this is why I'm talking about this, because I think it's extremely important for the society of the aggressor country. This is the only way to heal, to have the support also from the outside, but also, of course, from the inside. And that's why I'm saying that without our contacts with our colleagues from Croatia during the war, without the contacts between the writers during the war, filmmakers, theater persons, we will never have this cooperation that we are having today, and we will never have this conference, for example, because we will never have confidence into each other without starting it during the war. I fully agree, but we said, okay, we are dealing with Serbian responsibility, but we need our colleagues all around ex-Yugoslavia in order to build the new society. Without that, we cannot talk about the peace. If we stick the front line in our minds, we will never get out of them.
Thank you. You know, it was a really nice closure. Thank you all for putting up with us. I'm sorry if I was a bit harsh on my, speakers. If I give you a hard time, it's good time for the audience. So it's, it's a zero-sum game. Okay, thank you all.